He wasn't angry. He was trying to tell them something. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The moment Ryan Carter's wrists were secured and security began escorting him across the concrete walkway, something inside the enclosure changed. Atlas, the massive silverback who had been quietly sitting in the shade just seconds earlier, suddenly stood up to his full height. His eyes locked on Ryan with an intensity that made nearby visitors freeze mid-step. At first, it looked like confusion, Atlas tilting his head, watching as Ryan said something no one could hear, but then came the sound. A deep, resonant call echoed through the habitat, not aggressive, not wild, but urgent. Staff turned immediately. Atlas moved closer to the glass barrier, placing both hands against it, his breath fogging the surface as he followed every step Ryan took. Families pulled their children closer, unsure what they were witnessing. This wasn't part of the daily routine. Atlas never reacted like this. As Ryan was guided past the last checkpoint, Atlas let out another call, louder this time, his body shifting from stillness to restless motion. He paced once, twice, then returned to the exact same spot, pressing his palm against the glass again, as if trying to reach through it. Why is he doing that? Someone whispered. No one answered. A staff member radioed for assistance, her voice tight with uncertainty. Atlas wasn't known for unpredictable behavior. In fact, he was considered one of the calmest primates in the entire facility. Yet now, he refused to look away from the man being taken out. Ryan glanced back just once. For a split second, their eyes met. And something about that moment made the air feel heavier, like there was more happening beneath the surface than anyone understood. As the doors closed behind Ryan and he disappeared from view, Atlas didn't calm down. He stayed there, watching, waiting. Minutes passed, then more. Visitors began to murmur. Some recorded on their phones, others simply stared. Atlas didn't lash out. He didn't act wild. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He sat directly in front of the glass, his gaze fixed on the empty path Ryan had taken, completely still, as if expecting him to return. When a handler approached cautiously, calling his name, Atlas didn't respond. Not even a glance. It was as if the rest of the world had vanished for him. That's not normal, the handler muttered under her breath. Another staff member tried tossing a piece of fruit into the enclosure, something Atlas would normally accept immediately. It landed just a few feet away. Atlas didn't move, didn't even look. The radio chatter picked up again. Questions, confusion, concern. Because this wasn't just a reaction. It was a pattern beginning to form. Atlas wasn't just upset. He was focused. And whatever he was focused on had just walked out of that gate in handcuffs. By the next morning, the entire primate wing felt different, like something unseen had settled into the air overnight. Atlas had not moved much since the previous afternoon. According to the overnight logs, he had remained in nearly the exact same position for hours, occasionally shifting his weight, but never leaving the front section of the enclosure where he had last seen Ryan. The early morning staff noticed it immediately. Usually, Atlas would be active at sunrise, climbing, foraging, or at least acknowledging the keepers who greeted him. But today he did none of that. He sat facing the service gate, his posture upright, his eyes alert, as if he were waiting for something specific to happen. When the first feeding bucket was brought in, filled with his usual mix of fruit, vegetables, and protein biscuits, he did not react. The bucket was placed just a few feet away, well within reach. Atlas did not even glance at it. That is not like him, one of the junior keepers said quietly, glancing at her colleague. She had worked with Atlas for 3 years and had never seen him ignore food. Not once. Another keeper tried calling his name, her voice calm and familiar. Atlas, come on, buddy. Nothing. No shift in posture, no flicker of attention. It was as if he had tuned out everything except that empty gate. By mid-morning, word had spread among the staff. Something was clearly off. Dr. Melissa Grant was called in to observe. She stood at a distance at first, watching carefully, taking mental notes. Atlas was not displaying signs of aggression. There was no pacing and agitation, no attempts to challenge the enclosure. Instead, There was a kind of stillness that felt deliberate. Focused. He is not acting out, she said softly. He is fixated. The distinction mattered. A fixated animal was not unpredictable. It was reacting to something specific. The question was what? As the hours passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. Every time a staff member walked past the enclosure, Atlas remained still. But when a particular figure appeared down the corridor, even at a distance, Atlas reacted instantly. His head lifted. His eyes sharpened. His entire posture shifted. That figure was Victor Hayes, the head of security. The first time it happened, it seemed like coincidence. Victor was making routine rounds, speaking into his radio, barely paying attention to the enclosure. But Atlas noticed him. The moment Victor came into view, Atlas stood up, took 2 deliberate steps forward, and placed his hand against the glass again. Not with force, not with panic, but with unmistakable intention. Victor paused briefly, glancing over, then continued walking. Atlas followed him with his gaze until he disappeared from sight. When Victor was gone, Atlas returned to stillness. Dr. Grant saw it happen twice, then a third time. By the fourth, she was certain it was not random. He is tracking him, she murmured, her eyes narrowing slightly. Only him. The other staff exchanged uneasy looks. You think he recognizes him? Someone asked. Dr. Grant did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped a little closer to the glass, careful not to startle Atlas. His eyes did not shift toward her. They remained fixed on the direction Victor had gone. It is more than recognition, she finally said. It is expectation. That word hung in the air. Because expectation meant Atlas was not just reacting to what had happened. He was anticipating something else. Something that had not happened yet. And whatever that was, it had something to do with the man who had just walked past as if nothing had changed. By the afternoon of the second day, the tension inside the facility had shifted from concern to quiet urgency. Atlas had still not eaten. Not a single piece of food had been touched since Ryan was taken away, and now the uneaten portions had begun to dry under the enclosure lights. Staff rotated in and out, trying different approaches, different tones, different routines, but nothing broke through whatever state Atlas had locked himself into. He continued to sit near the viewing glass, his body calm, but his eyes constantly alert, scanning the same path again and again as if replaying a moment no one else could see. Dr. Melissa Grant stood beside the observation panel, reviewing footage from the previous day on a tablet, her expression growing more focused with each clip. Run it back, she said quietly to the technician. The video replayed the moment Ryan was escorted out. Atlas's reaction was immediate, not delayed, not confused. He had not looked at the officers. He had not reacted to the movement of people. He had reacted to Ryan specifically. And then, just before Ryan disappeared from view, Atlas's gaze shifted briefly towards someone else standing off to the side. The technician paused the frame. There, Dr. Grant said, pointing. In the corner of the footage, partially obscured by a support beam, stood Victor Hayes, watching the scene with his arms crossed. Atlas's eyes had flicked to him for less than a second, but it was enough to register. That is the same direction he keeps watching, Dr. Grant murmured. He is not just waiting for Ryan. He is connecting something. Out in the enclosure, a maintenance cart rolled past, its wheels rattling softly against the concrete. Atlas's head lifted slightly, then settled again when the sound faded. But moments later, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Atlas reacted instantly. He stood up, his posture straightening, his attention sharpening. Victor Hayes appeared again, walking at a steady pace, speaking quietly into his radio. The moment he entered Atlas's line of sight, Atlas moved forward, closing the distance to the glass with controlled, deliberate steps. He placed his hand against the surface once more, his eyes fixed directly on Victor. Not wide, not aggressive, but intensely focused. Victor slowed this time. He looked at Atlas for a second longer than before, then gave a small nod to a nearby staff member and continued walking. Atlas tracked him the entire way until he disappeared around the corner. Then, just like before, Atlas returned to his position and sat down, facing the same direction, as if waiting for the next appearance. That is not random, one of the keepers said under her breath. Dr. Grant nodded slowly. No, it is not. She turned back to the tablet, pulling up another angle from a different camera. This one showed the restricted service corridor just outside the primate wing, recorded minutes before Ryan had been escorted out. The hallway was quiet at first. Then Ryan entered the frame, walking quickly, his expression tense. Victor appeared moments later, stepping into his path. There was no audio, but the body language told a clear story. Ryan was speaking, gesturing towards something off-screen, something deeper in the restricted area. Victor shook his head, then stepped closer, blocking the path. Ryan did not back away. He pointed again, more urgently this time. Then 2 security officers entered the frame, and everything changed direction. He was trying to show him something, Dr. Grant said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent. Because if that was true, then Atlas had not just witnessed Ryan being taken away. He had witnessed what happened right before it. And now, with every fixed stare and every deliberate movement, Atlas was not just reacting. He was trying to guide them back to the moment everyone else had missed. By early evening, the quiet concern among the staff had hardened into something more serious. Atlas had now gone nearly 48 hours without eating, and while his physical condition was still stable, the behavioral pattern was impossible to ignore. He was not deteriorating in a typical way. He was holding himself in a state of waiting, as if every moment that passed without resolution only reinforced whatever he believed was unfinished. Dr. Melissa Grant stood with the senior staff in the control room, the glow of multiple camera feeds reflecting across their faces. "We cannot keep assuming this is stress," she said calmly, but firmly. "This is targeted behavior. He is responding to something specific." One of the administrators shifted uneasily. "With respect, Doctor, we have protocols for this. If an animal refuses food for this long, we escalate intervention. Sedation, relocation if necessary." The word relocation hung heavy in the room. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood what it meant for Atlas. Removing him from the enclosure would not just be a medical decision. It would be a permanent change to everything he had known. "That would be a mistake," Dr. Grant replied without hesitation. "He is not losing control. He is trying to communicate within the only system he has." "Communicate what?" another voice asked. Dr. Grant turned back toward the screens and replayed the corridor footage once more. Ryan pointing toward the restricted area. Victor stepping in front of him. The arrival of security. The abrupt end to the interaction. "Something happened in that hallway," she said quietly. And Atlas saw enough of it to understand that it mattered. In the enclosure, Atlas shifted slightly, adjusting his position as the overhead lights dimmed for the evening cycle. The usual sounds of the facility softened, replaced by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional echo of footsteps from night staff. Atlas's eyes remained open, reflecting the faint light, still directed toward the same path. A junior keeper approached cautiously with a fresh tray of food, placing it a little closer than before. "Come on, Atlas," she said gently, her voice almost pleading. "Just a little." For a brief second, Atlas's gaze flickered downward toward the tray. The keeper held her breath. But then, just as quickly, his attention returned to the corridor. The moment passed. "He is choosing not to eat," she whispered as she stepped back. "That is different." In the control room, a decision was forming. Not official, not yet, but present in the silence between conversations. If Atlas's behavior continued, intervention would become unavoidable. Dr. Grant knew that. Everyone did. But she also knew something else. "We are looking at this the wrong way," she said, turning to face the group again. "We keep asking what is wrong with him. We should be asking what he is pointing at." The room went quiet. Because once that question was asked, it changed everything. It meant the focus was no longer on Atlas as a problem to solve, but as a source of information. And if that was true, then the next step was not to calm him down. It was to follow his attention. "I want access to that restricted corridor," Dr. Grant said. "Full access. Tonight." One of the administrators hesitated. "That area is under security control." "Then we involve security," she replied. "Because if we do not, we are going to make a decision about this animal based on incomplete information." Out in the enclosure, Atlas remained still, his presence quiet but unyielding. He did not pace. He did not call out. He simply watched, waiting for someone, anyone, to understand that what he had seen was not over. And somewhere beyond that corridor, whatever Ryan had tried to show before everything went wrong was still there, unnoticed, unresolved, and growing more important with every passing hour. The restricted corridor felt colder than the rest of the facility, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, as if fewer people passed through it for a reason. Dr. Melissa Grant walked alongside a reluctant security escort, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished concrete floor. Overhead lights cast long shadows that stretched toward a row of secured doors, each marked with access codes and warning labels. "This is as far as standard staff are allowed," the guard said, stopping near a reinforced entry panel. Dr. Grant did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved slowly across the hallway, taking in every detail, every corner, every surface that might have been overlooked. "Ryan was pointing somewhere down here," she said quietly. "I want to see everything beyond this point." The guard hesitated, then tapped his radio. A brief exchange followed, voices low and controlled, before the panel beside the door emitted a soft beep. The lock disengaged. "You have 10 minutes, he said. "That is all I can authorize." Dr. Grant nodded and stepped through. Inside, the corridor narrowed slightly, the air filled with the faint hum of refrigeration units and distant mechanical systems. Storage rooms lined both sides, most of them sealed, some with small observation windows revealing equipment, medical supplies, and transport crates. Nothing immediately stood out. Nothing obvious. But Dr. Grant did not rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, letting her instincts guide her rather than searching for something specific. Halfway down the corridor, she stopped. There was a door slightly ajar, unlike the others which were fully closed and secured. A thin line of light spilled into the hallway. "That was not like that earlier," she murmured. The guard glanced at his checklist. "That room should be sealed after hours." Dr. Grant approached carefully and pushed the door open just enough to look inside. The room was dim, illuminated by a single overhead light. Inside were several enclosures, smaller than the main habitats, used for temporary holding or medical observation. Most were empty, but one was not. In the far corner, a small primate sat quietly, its posture subdued, its movements minimal. It was not unusual to house animals temporarily, but something about the setup felt off. There were no active monitors connected, no visible charting on the door, no signs that the animal was scheduled for routine care. "Do you have a record for this one?" Dr. Grant asked, her voice steady. The guard frowned, checking his tablet. "I am not seeing anything listed for this enclosure tonight." Dr. Grant stepped a little closer, careful not to startle the animal. It looked up briefly, then lowered its gaze again. Not fearful, not aggressive. Just quiet. Too quiet. "This is what he was pointing at," she said under her breath. The guard shifted uneasily. "If it is not logged, it should not be here." Dr. Grant turned back toward the hallway, her mind connecting pieces that had not made sense before. Ryan had not been arguing randomly. He had not been resisting authority without reason. He had been trying to show something that did not belong, something that had been placed here without proper record. "We need to pull the access logs for this corridor," she said firmly. "Every entry, every exit, every code used in the last 48 hours. The guard nodded, already reaching for his radio. As they stepped back into the hallway, Dr. Grant glanced once more at the partially opened door. Somewhere back in the enclosure, Atlas was still waiting, still watching, still holding on to the moment that everyone else had almost ignored. And now, for the first time, it was clear that he had not been reacting without reason. He had been pointing directly at the one place no one had thought to check. The moment Dr. Melissa Grant stepped back into the control room, the entire energy shifted. What had been uncertainty was now something much sharper, something focused. The access logs were already being pulled up on the central monitor, lines of timestamps and authorization codes scrolling rapidly as the system processed the last 48 hours. "Freeze it there," she said, pointing at a cluster of entries just hours before Ryan had been escorted out. The technician zoomed in. Multiple access points. Same corridor. Same secured door. But the name attached to the authorization code was not from the veterinary team and not from standard animal care staff. It belonged to Victor Hayes. The room went quiet. "That room is not under his responsibility," one of the administrators said slowly. Dr. Grant did not look away from the screen. "No, it is not." She traced the sequence with her finger. Entry logged. Door access granted. No corresponding exit log for over 2 hours. Then, just minutes before Ryan appeared on the corridor footage, another entry. Same code. Same door. "He was in there," she said, right before Ryan tried to show him something. A heavy silence followed, because now the timeline was no longer Unclear. It was precise, and it pointed in one direction. We need to review every camera angle from that hallway again, Dr. Grant continued. Frame by frame. The footage was pulled up immediately. This time, they were not watching for general movement. They were looking for details. Small things. Anything that did not belong. The video replayed. Ryan entering the frame. His pace urgent. His gestures directed toward the deeper section of the corridor. Victor stepping in, blocking him. The exchange that followed. Then security arriving. But this time, something else stood out. Just before Ryan pointed down the hallway, he glanced briefly toward the camera mounted above the door. Not by accident. It was deliberate. As if he knew it was there. As if he wanted something recorded. Pause, Dr. Grant said. The frame froze. Ryan's hand extended, pointing past Victor, directly toward the partially open room they had just inspected. He was not just arguing, she said quietly. He was trying to leave evidence. The realization settled over the room like a weight. Because if that was true, then Ryan had not been reacting emotionally. He had been trying to expose something. And Atlas had seen enough of that moment to understand its importance. Bring up the enclosure feed, Dr. Grant said. The screen switched. Atlas was still there, exactly where he had been for hours, sitting in front of the glass, facing the corridor. But now, with everything they had just seen, his stillness no longer felt passive. It felt intentional, purposeful, as if he had been holding that moment in place, refusing to let it be forgotten. He saw Victor come out of that room. One of the staff members whispered. He saw Ryan point at it. And then he saw Ryan taken away. Dr. Grant nodded slowly. And now he is trying to connect those pieces for us. In that instant, the entire narrative flipped. Atlas was not the problem. He was the witness. The only one who had no reason to ignore what he had seen. We need to secure that room immediately, Dr. Grant said, her voice steady but firm. And we need to document everything inside before anything changes. The administrator hesitated for only a second. Before nodding, orders were given. Radios crackled to life. Movement spread through the facility with new urgency. And out in the enclosure, Atlas remained exactly where he was, his eyes fixed on the same path, waiting. Not for food, not for comfort, but for someone to finally understand that what he had been trying to show them was real, and that the truth he had witnessed was now beginning to surface. The restricted room was sealed within minutes, and for the first time since the situation began, the staff were no longer reacting blindly, but moving with purpose. Dr. Melissa Grant stood just outside the doorway as a small team documented every detail inside, their voices low, their movements careful and precise. Photographs were taken. Inventory was logged. Every surface was examined. And the more they looked, the clearer it became that something about this setup did not follow protocol. There were no proper intake records, no scheduled evaluations, no standard documentation that should accompany any animal housed within the facility. It was as if the room had been used outside the normal system, quietly, without oversight. This was never processed through veterinary intake, one of the technicians said, scrolling through the database again. There is nothing here. No ID, no transfer request, nothing. Dr. Grant nodded slowly, her attention shifting back to the small primate in the enclosure. It remained calm, almost unusually so, as if it had grown accustomed to being unseen. That is not an accident, she said. That is intentional. Behind her, footsteps approached quickly. One of the administrators entered, his expression tense. Security is asking questions, he said. Victor Hayes is requesting to know why this area has been locked down. Dr. Grant did not turn around immediately. Then he already knows something has changed, she replied. The administrator hesitated. Do we confront him? Dr. Grant finally faced him, her expression steady. Not yet. Not until we have everything documented. We move carefully. Out in the main enclosure, the night cycle had fully taken over. The lights were dimmed, the pathways quiet, the last of the visitors long gone. Atlas remained in his position, his silhouette barely visible against the faint glow of the habitat lights. But even in the dimness, his presence was unmistakable. He had not moved from that spot for hours. Not once. A night keeper approached slowly, carrying a fresh tray of food, placing it gently near the glass. You have to eat something, she whispered, her voice soft with concern. For a brief moment, Atlas shifted. His head lowered slightly, his eyes flickering toward the tray. The keeper held her breath. But then, Just as before, his attention returned to the corridor. The moment passed. Back in the control room, the final pieces were coming together. The access logs, the footage, the unregistered enclosure, all pointing toward the same conclusion. If this was not logged, then it was not supposed to be found, one of the staff members said quietly. Dr. Grant nodded. And Ryan found it anyway. The weight of that realization settled heavily over the room, because it meant that everything that had happened was not random. It was a chain of events triggered by one discovery. And Atlas had been there for the most important part of it. We need to bring Ryan back, Dr. Grant said. Immediately, the administrator looked uncertain. That is not a simple request. He was removed under security authority. Then we escalate, she replied firmly, because he is the only one who knows exactly what he saw in that room. Outside, a faint sound echoed through the corridor. Footsteps. Steady. Approaching. Atlas reacted instantly. He stood up, moving toward the glass with controlled urgency, his eyes locking onto the direction of the sound. The night keeper stepped back, startled. What is it, Atlas? She whispered. But Atlas did not look at her. He did not look at anything except the corridor, because someone was coming. And whatever was about to happen next, he had been waiting for it all along. The footsteps grew louder, steady and unmistakable, echoing through the quiet corridor like a signal that something long delayed was finally about to happen. Atlas stood motionless at the glass, his entire body aligned toward the sound, his attention sharper than it had been at any point since Ryan was taken away. The night keeper stepped aside instinctively, her eyes fixed on the hallway as well. Then the figure appeared. It was not Victor Hayes. It was not another security officer. It was Ryan. He walked slowly, flanked by a senior administrator rather than guards this time. His expression controlled, but filled with something deeper, something that had not been there before. Relief mixed with urgency. The moment Atlas saw him, everything changed. The tension that had been holding his body in stillness seemed to release all at once. He stepped forward quickly, closing the distance to the glass, placing both hands against it with a firm but calm motion. His eyes locked onto Ryan's, unblinking, searching, as if confirming something that only he could understand. Ryan stopped just a few feet from the enclosure, his breath catching slightly as he met Atlas's gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them carried more weight than anything that had been said over the past 2 days. Hey, Atlas, Ryan said softly, his voice steady but emotional. I am here. Atlas let out a low, deep sound, not loud, not distressed, but unmistakably different from anything the staff had heard since this began. It was not a call for help. It was recognition. Behind Ryan, Dr. Melissa Grant stepped forward, her eyes moving between the two of them. Ryan, we need you to show us, she said gently. Whatever you were trying to point out before. Ryan nodded without hesitation. It is down the corridor, he replied. The room that should not be in use. The administrator beside him gave a small signal, and the group began to move. Ryan walked with purpose now, no longer uncertain, no longer restrained. Atlas watched every step, his head turning slowly to follow, his eyes never leaving Ryan until he disappeared around the corner. But this time, Atlas did not return to stillness. He remained standing, alert, as if he knew that what was happening now would finally resolve what had been left unfinished. Back in the restricted corridor, the room had already been secured, the documentation in progress. As Ryan entered, he moved directly toward the enclosure in the far corner. This is what I saw, he said, his voice firm. This animal was brought in without intake, without records. I tried to report it, but he blocked me. He did not say Victor's name, but no one needed him to. The implication was clear. Dr. Grant stepped beside him, observing the same details they had already begun to piece together. But hearing it from Ryan confirmed everything. You were not resisting, she said quietly. You were trying to show us this. Ryan nodded. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the logs missing. And then I saw him come out of here. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not confusion. It was realization. Because now the story was complete. Atlas had not reacted randomly. He had witnessed the moment that connected everything. He had seen Ryan try to expose it. And when Ryan was taken away, Atlas had refused to let that moment disappear. Back in the enclosure, Atlas slowly lowered himself to the ground, his posture finally relaxing for the first time in 2 days. The waiting was over. The connection had been made. And for the first time since it all began, The truth he had been holding onto was no longer his alone. By the following morning, the facility no longer felt like a place of uncertainty. It felt like a place that had just uncovered something it could not ignore. The restricted room had been fully documented, and the findings were already moving through the proper channels, triggering internal investigations that extended far beyond the primate wing. Victor Hayes had been removed from active duty pending review, his access privileges revoked, his presence notably absent from the corridors he once walked so confidently. Staff members spoke in quieter tones now, not out of fear, but out of recognition that something serious had been exposed, something that had been hidden in plain sight until the moment it could no longer stay buried. In the enclosure, Atlas sat near the glass once again, but this time his posture was different. There was no tension in his shoulders, no fixed stare toward the corridor. Instead, he shifted his attention toward the tray of food that had been refreshed. Earlier that morning, slowly, deliberately, he reached forward and picked up a piece of fruit, bringing it to his mouth. The nearby keepers exchanged glances, relief spreading across their faces in a way that did not need words. "He is eating," one of them whispered, almost as if speaking too loudly might interrupt the moment. Dr. Melissa Grant stood a few feet back, watching quietly, her expression calm but thoughtful. She had seen behavioral shifts before, but nothing like this. This was not recovery from stress. This was resolution. Atlas had held on to something, carried it through silence, and now that it had been acknowledged, he no longer needed to. A short distance away, Ryan Carter stood just outside the enclosure, his hands resting lightly at his sides. He had been cleared of any wrongdoing, his position reinstated, but what mattered most to him in that moment was not the administrative outcome. It was the quiet exchange happening through the glass. Atlas looked up, their eyes meeting once again, but this time there was no urgency, no question left unanswered. Ryan gave a small nod, almost instinctively, and Atlas responded in the only way he could, lowering his head slightly before returning to his food. It was simple, but it said everything. Later that afternoon, as the facility returned to a more familiar rhythm, staff members began to reflect on what had happened. Not in official reports, not in formal meetings, but in quiet conversations between people who had witnessed something they could not fully explain. "He knew," one of the keepers said softly. "He saw it all, and he knew it mattered." Dr. Grant did not correct her. She did not try to define it in clinical terms or reduce it to behavior patterns. Because what Atlas had done went beyond routine observation. He had connected moments, held on to meaning, and refused to let it disappear. And in doing so,